If you're an American, there's likely not much else you value more than your individual freedom and personal agency. And like most, you also likely value your technology, especially the kind that levels up your convenience and helps you joyfully participate in consumerist means of entertainment. But what if the latter threatened the former? What if your favorite tech is using your most mundane of digital decisions to predict patterns you didn't even know you have in order to steer you in directions that you might not otherwise go? My next guest has worked in nearly every form of media. He was a correspondent for NBC News and is currently the founding editor and host of the Rip Current newsletter and podcast, which looks at the hidden forces of modern life like big tech, business, and politics. He's also the author of The Loop: How AI is Creating a World Without Choices and How You Can Fight Back. Today, we're going to explore how opting in to every AI offer may cause us to unknowingly opt out of our free will. As we ask the question, is AI manipulating us? This is the Curious Introvert podcast with me, Meredith. Around here, we explore taboo questions and societal blind spots. My mission, and yours if you choose to accept it, is to inspire curiosity by exploring the nuance and paradox of our world. Please help me welcome the man tackling difficult topics with ease, explorer of ethics and forecaster of possibility with responsibility, Mr. Jake Ward. Thanks for being here.
Meredith, what a fantastic introduction. I struggle to talk about what I'm about, and you just summed it up very beautifully. So I appreciate that. I'm going to be cribbing quite a bit of that, I think, in the future.
Well, you are most welcome to. It's a hard topic to kind of talk about and explain because people like define AI differently and they're so busy using it. They
Sure.
don't often stop to go, should I be doing this? It's like that Jurassic Park scene, like, just because we can, does it mean that we
Yeah,
should?
that's right.
Well, there's this sci-fi element too, right? Because we've got romantic companion chatbots, but we also have teachers who are preventing their own burnout by streamlining some of those more mundane things. But we also have like the problem where people are not being able to distinguish AI videos from real videos. And so we're kind of like in the thick of it. I'm curious because when you wrote The Loop, it was 9 months before ChatGPT kind of entered the world.
Yeah.
What a weird time to,
Yeah.
to publish that book.
I thought I was like 5 years early, but that's right. It came out 9 months later, much to my shock.
Right. So what's that like for you now, today, sitting where you are, seeing the landscape of AI?
Yeah. Well, I have to admit to you that I have spent the last kind of year and a half sort of in hibernation, in a kind of hermitage around it, because I've been so discouraged by, you write a book like this and you think, oh, I want to be right.
Yeah.
You want to be right. And then when you are right about something as dark as my thesis, which is that sort of our brains and our society are not ready for commercial AI, and then to have that bear out, it sucks. That turns out to suck. Like, I wish I hadn't been right about it. And I wish I had been 5 years early. I wish I hadn't been right up against the release of ChatGPT the way I was. So it's been tough. I mean, I think that there is enormous potential in this technology, as there is in every technology. It's just the way people choose to make money off of it or foist it on us for their benefit that really makes the difference. And so, on the one hand, I think there are going to be some tremendous uses for this stuff in foundational science, and there's going to be all kinds of good uses for it. But the ones that are going to make these companies back their money are the ones that I think are going to, just by their very nature, wind up taking advantage of our brains in the way that I try to explain in the book. And so I've been very discouraged to watch how quickly we've been racing to the bottom when it comes to how we're going to take advantage of each other using this stuff.
Well, I don't think you're the only one that feels that. Maybe this is a moment where we can kind of help console the other person that's like, oh, we're all fucked,
I know.
because you're not the only person. I imagine you feel it much stronger having written the book and done all this research and having your professional life be in so many sectors and seeing it across the board. But are there philosophers of science or, respected journalists like you who are invited to the table to have these broader discussions about, laws and regulations about this sort of thing?
There are. I mean, it is the case that in case that some of these companies and some of the policymakers will call in certain people to, testify and write reports and figure it out. And there's a lot of really good, smart people doing that kind of work. I really admire people who have had more endurance than I have when it comes to getting involved with this stuff. But there is also a huge amount of regulatory capture, which is what they call it, right?
Yeah.
When a company comes along and I mean, at one point, Sam Altman, the head of OpenAI, went to Washington, D.C. to testify before Congress. And before he did it, the night before, he brought about 60 senators together for a dinner and a big demo that they all emerged from absolutely dazzled, right? He was showing off like what these things can do. And so it's very much sort of in the playbook of these companies to get themselves appointed policy advisor on the very thing they make. I once interviewed the former CEO of Google. I was asking him about AI regulation, and he was so interesting because he basically said two things that really stuck with me. One, he said, you should really just only let those of us smart enough to build these systems think about the regulation of these systems. He basically was like, the people who are in power, lawmakers just aren't smart enough basically to think about this stuff appropriately, and so you should just leave it to us. And then he also in the same conversation he said I wasn't aware at the time of how damaging social media was going to be. I was very naive about the effect it would have on society when I was the CEO of Google, at a time when Google was trying to like create their own social media platform. He said, so we got it wrong then, but you can trust us this time. This time we've figured it out. This time we can be trusted. And it's that kind of feeling that like these companies really consider themselves to be the only people smart enough to deal with the fallout from their product, and at the same time they seem to have absolutely no ability to recognize how badly this kind of thinking has gotten us into trouble in the past.
This is so fascinating because what you're describing is like corporate exceptionalism, right? And that's on the manufacturing side. And then on the consumer side, we have American exceptionalism, right? Where we don't seem to have bandwidth to look at consequences that have already taken place in other places, in
Yeah.
other countries, and gone, oh gee golly, this could be a problem. But because there's evidence of hope in these other case studies, like Chile, for example, has amended their constitution to protect neuro rights. I think you were the one that told me India has outlawed self-driving cars because of the negative impact it would have on the economy. So there are examples of these like thoughtful considerations around regulation, but I feel like the culture of American exceptionalism prevents us from going, well, that could happen here.
Yeah,
Gosh,
right.
maybe we should prevent it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I think that it is, when you look around the world, I mean, the European Union also has a lot of language in their regulations around AI talking about preserving agency and preserving independence of thought. And it's a concept that we really hate culturally in the United States. I think it has to do with the myth of the American frontier, the idea that we're all supposed to sort of be these independent thinkers who go with our gut and, don't tell me the odds, and all of that kind of Han Solo rhetoric, right, is the
Yeah.
way we imagine ourselves. And the problem that I tried to sort of identify in the book, and that a huge amount of my reporting in my career has shown me, is that, where you want to believe that, that where the movies show that going with your gut and ignoring common advice is the best possible way to like break through, the actual math of making a good decision is actually quite boring and makes for a terrible movie, right?
Yeah.
Like if you actually take the proper steps to think a thing through, that makes for a really boring plot. And so we've just been sort of like drawn into this idea of the sort of, transgressive rebel who's going to kind of break on through. The other part of it that is such a bummer for trying to make good decisions and trying to build systems that support good decisions in this country is we just hate to we love to blame people for their own choices, no matter how
Yes.
much those choices have been manipulated, right? So for me, I'm a former drinker. I quit drinking in 2016, and whenever I see the little label at the bottom of the drinking ads that say "drink responsibly," and now that language has moved over into the gambling ads, "game responsibly," there's this illusion that I could somehow have a responsible relationship with alcohol, that it's somehow on me to make that choice. When in fact, if you look at the way in which the alcohol industry has learned to work alcoholism, for its advantage, it's the same thing with social media companies, and now I would argue with the way that AI is going to end up manipulating our behavior is like there's some of the smartest people in the world have been hired into these companies to create the most manipulative and addictive product they possibly can. But in the US, we just hate to look at that and to consider ourselves victims of that. We love to blame the addict. We love to blame the victim. And to my mind, that's one of our greatest challenges, I think, in this country. Whereas in other countries like Chile, as you've pointed out, or like the EU, they're very open to the idea of like, oh yeah, your thoughts are not always your own, especially when you're up against these incredibly smart people working with the resources of whole nation states at their disposal.
I love that you bring up the example of alcohol because that is such the perfect example of how we don't give the right credit to substances like that. And someone who does a great job at unpacking that is a fellow podcaster, Jill Teets. And
Mm.
she unpacks it with a morally neutral approach. And so she says like, alcohol, it takes over your prefrontal cortex. The nature of alcohol is to shut down the part of your brain that is like higher level thinking. And that is what you unpacked in your book with the first and second loops, because you talk about how the first loop, more of our primal brain,
Mm-hmm.
fights with the second loop, which is like modern systems taking advantage of said primal brain.
Mm-hmm.
And all I could think about when I was reading that is, do you remember the game Rock'em Sock'em
Oh
Robots?
yeah, I do. I sure do.
Right. So like I'm picturing this like one is the first brain and one is the second brain and
Mm.
they're just dueling it out and everyone's looking at the plastic robots in the middle of the ring but nobody realizes like hey, there's a bunch of 10-year-olds who are jacked up on Mountain Dew running this whole thing, guys. Maybe we could have a different conversation. I think we're
Mm-hmm.
solving for the wrong problem here. So
Yeah.
maybe you could explain the first and second brain for
Sure. Yeah.
us.
Yeah. So a huge amount of the inspiration of this book comes from basically the last sort of 50 years of behavioral science. And one of the big figures in the last 50 years of behavioral science is a guy named Daniel Kahneman, who wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. That was a really famous one. He won the Nobel Prize in economics. He's a psychologist. And beginning in the 1970s with a partner named Amos Tversky, he began to create these very smart experiments for basically showing us that if you deprive human beings of enough time and enough information and you force them to make a choice around statistics or money or something else logical, not only do we make mistakes, but those mistakes are incredibly predictable. They very quickly figured out that we have these really hardwired tendencies. And out of that came his big theory that he began to articulate once he had won the Nobel Prize, which he calls the fast thinking brain, the slow thinking brain, or system one and system two. So system one is what we in conversation we call like our lizard brain, right? It's your automatic system that makes the vast majority of your decisions for you. That's the system, for instance, that when you drive by accident to the wrong place, if you've ever like got tuned out and you come to and you're in your kid's school parking lot and you realize, oh my God, I'm supposed to be taking her to volleyball, not to school, and you cast your mind back across that drive and you go, wow, like I wasn't even conscious for that, which means that you were like, you're avoiding other steel death machines. You're doing 60 miles an hour on the freeway. You're stopping at stoplights. All of that mechanical and cognitive work is happening outside of your consciousness. And it really is outside of your consciousness. That's your lizard brain. That's the system that it turns out, is making your food choices for you. It's choosing who to trust and who not to trust. That's your gut. That's those gut instincts, which have gotten us a long way. It's why we are the people we are. It's the shortcut that allowed us to run when there was danger and not trust enemy tribesmen and all of that stuff. So that system is like more than 1 million years old. It is a very ancient system that we have in common with primates and even some monkeys. So that system in evolutionary terms is like a really great piece of software that has been just tested and tested and debugged, and it is rock solid, right? Then, about 100,000 years ago, we developed this new system, this system 2, this slow thinking brain. And this is the part of our brains that goes, hey, I wonder what's going on beyond that campfire. Or I wonder what happens after we die. Or I wonder what else is what's going on over the horizon. And that's the part of our brains that is cautious and rational and reasonable and creative, and has created the kind of egalitarian and civic infrastructure that we enjoy. The reason that we have science and medicine and hospitals and traffic cones and clothes and all of that stuff is because we developed that ability. So the first loop is just there's this hardwired lizard brain, right? That like a huge amount of your decision making happens outside of your consciousness and is done by this ancient automatic system. The second loop that I'm trying to articulate is the ways in which modern systems take advantage of that for money. And, cigarettes is the classic, right? That is a hardwired nicotine response. And, nicotine delivery is an incredibly profitable business because it just plays on our wiring. It also kills us after we've already had kids. So we pass on that addiction, any genetic predisposition to that addiction. Like it is a perfect way of taking advantage of our circuitry and our tendencies. That's sort of the modern loop that I'm thinking about. And then the loop that I'm really naming the book for, the third loop, is this idea that going forward, now that we have these AI systems that can take vast amounts of data and find patterns in it very easily that human eyes could never catch, we're going to now be aiming that at our tendencies, at these kinds of tendencies that people like Daniel Kahneman figured out, and using them, I think, to predict and even shape our behavior to make money, to win political office, for influence and financial gain. And it's the kind of thing that, like, if you continue to just believe that, like, everyone's in charge of their choices, well, that is the perfect cover for an industry that's going to begin trying to take advantage of this one part of your brain and trying to knock the other part of your brain, the slower, more cautious, more rational, more reasonable part of your brain out of it. Because fundamentally, the big takeaway here is if people want to sell a thing to you, would they rather speak to the really thoughtful, rational, reasonable brain, right, that thinks things through and counts its money and makes plans for the future? No, they're going to want to sell to the lizard brain. They want the part that can't resist looking at, cleavage, right? And is you know what I mean? Like it is absolutely hardwired to respond a certain way to certain stimuli. And that part of your brain is going to be so thoroughly decoded by this new form of AI. That's what really has me worried.
And that's the part that I think really butts heads with especially American culture. I think it's particularly my Midwestern tendencies that feel that resistance because farmers who survived winters are very like pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of
Yeah.
folks. So I was struggling with this principle that you were laying out in the book until you laid out the three heuretics. And
Hmm.
then I was like, oh gosh, because it is hard for us to think like opposite of the statement we all hear. At the end of the day, you're the one that makes the
Yeah, yeah,
decisions,
yeah. Right, right.
and so, but when you laid out the three heretics, I was like, oh, nope, okay, I'm starting to see. So I know that's
Hmm.
kind of like a complicated explanation, but do you have like a Reader's Digest version that you can share for the audience? Because it was fundamental for me to understand, and I'm wondering if it may be for the listener
Yeah,
also.
that's a great. I really appreciate that. So I've undergone a huge amount of the testing that these researchers have invented myself, and when you do these tests yourself, you so quickly realize, oh, I'm not special. I am just like every other test subject. I
Right.
respond the exact same way. I took endless tests, implicit bias tests, which have been around since the 90s, where you look at your attitudes about other categories of people. And it turns out, I'm married to a mixed race woman. I have mixed race kids. Like I just was like, well, I'm way beyond racism,
Yeah.
of course.
Yeah.
you take those tests and you immediately recognize, oh no, actually I'm just as quick to assume that someone with darker skin somehow is lower than me on the economic spectrum, or or more prone to crime, or terrible racist assumptions turn out to be absolutely baked into me. And what those researchers point out again and again is like, you've got to recognize that in yourself and just begin to sort of account for it and think of it not as a moral failing, think of it as like a peanut allergy. And then start to build your life
Yes.
around the idea that you've got this allergy. And some of these are really powerful and make some sense when you explain them. Others of them are really just weird little quirks that they don't even know what the evolutionary explanation might be. But like, here's an example. So one of them is they would do these tests where you'd throw a question at somebody like me, and you describe someone that's kind of nerdy and quiet and wears a lot of tweed, and then you'd ask people, which of these professions is this person most likely to be? Is it farmer, librarian, doctor, police officer, something like that? Of course, everyone chooses librarian. It's just the assumption you would make about it. But when they actually do the math on it, you see that, for instance, there's way more farmers than there are librarians. The math just makes so much more sense on choosing one of the other professions. But your brain just makes this assumption because it has been imprinted over and over again. The truth of the matter is, like, if you ever meet a real librarian, they're the least shy people ever. They talk to people all day long, and sometimes very crazy people all day long. So, these stereotypes that we have built up around these people make no sense. They're just based on what one of these researchers said is the sort of the bean counting of your brain. So one of the most powerful examples of this for me is there's a fantastic researcher at Yale named Yarrow Dunham who does this incredible experiment where he brings kids in. These are like 6 to 7-year-old kids, and he will sit them down and have them spin a little spinner that chooses either orange or green. And depending on which one it lands on, he then puts them in one of those t-shirts, an orange or green t-shirt. And he says, now you're on the orange team, or now you're on the green team. Then he begins showing them pictures of very ambiguous scenes in which a kid in an orange shirt and a kid in a green shirt are interacting in some way. One of them is, for instance, a kid is sitting on the ground crying in front of an empty swing, and a kid wearing the opposite shirt or the same shirt as the kid that is observing this scene is standing behind the swing looking kind of alarmed. And when you ask a kid who's wearing a shirt that matches the kid on the ground, that kid says, oh, that evil green kid pushed him out of the swing and hurt him, right? You show the kid a scene in which the kid standing behind the swing looking alarmed is wearing the same as the one who's watching. And he says, oh, the green kid fell out of the swing by accident and his friend is about to help him up. Like within 90 seconds, he has these kids making wild accusations about one another, wild assumptions. And as he points out, even though your brain has this mistaken impression, this totally mistaken, made up impression as to what's going on, what happens over time is that your brain begins to build up these instances as a body of evidence. These assumptions that you've made become this like evidence that kids in orange shirts are inherently evil somehow or something like that, right? And that kind of assumption becomes the basis of like, in the bad old days, social policy and, how loans were made and all kinds of stuff. And it's not just biased prejudice around one another. It's stuff like, it's weird quirks like if you're in a financial negotiation with somebody, whoever mentions a number first, the negotiation inevitably winds up anchoring to that number, and the final amount of money winds up being close to that number. There's just these weird habits of mind that just are part of our programming. And that's what the last 50 years of this science has shown us. And so you're absolutely right that like, I think people hate to think that this is true of so many of us. And I would argue of most of us, if not all of us. But also, I would also point out that if you're in the business of playing on that stuff, you don't want people recognizing that they have those tendencies, right? It really works to the advantage of people who are trying to play your circuitry to have this cultural rejection of the idea that we are playable. That part just really is the part that bothers me the most, is the irony of the fact that we are so vulnerable and yet we hate admitting our vulnerabilities.
So the three heuretics that you just kind of like laid out in story form, they're kind of like the truth of how we make decisions. And it seems like our modern society has labeled these ancient processes
Hmm.
to be permanent labels of damnation.
Yeah.
Like you're racist. And so like I love that you kind of frame it by way of allergy. Like, okay, we can inoculate ourselves or we can,
Yes.
make ourselves well again, or we can shift in some way, which is interesting when you compare that thought to like internet talk and
Oh yeah.
like,
Oh yeah.
hashtag do better and like
Yeah.
like
Right. Right.
like it really it's interesting because we're talking about tech, that it is the byproduct of the internet that kind of keeps us from even admitting with honesty that these things live in us all, because it is the state of the human condition.
Yeah. One of the things that bothers me most is just how often I speak to people who are in technology. I talk to people who work at companies whose whole business model is getting people addicted to literally like a gambling simulator. I've talked to people who work in these companies that literally are trying to trick you into playing a game you can never win. These casino simulators, they're called social casino games, where it costs money to play and you can't win any real money back. That literally just play on like social and addictive tendencies in people to try and wring as much money out of them as possible. And I've talked to people who work in those companies, and nobody takes a dimmer view of their customer than those people. They really just think, well, people can't control themselves, but that's not my fault. So I'm just making the best possible product I can off of the tendencies people have. I so often hear people who are in the business of dealing in human behavior who seem to have such a low opinion of people and so cynical of an opinion that they're willing to take advantage of this stuff. And that to me is such a dark part of it. Whereas I think the way you're describing it is exactly right. We should be bringing some grace to this, right? One of the originators of the implicit bias test is this researcher at Harvard named Mahzarin Banaji, and nobody's more familiar with how prejudiced people are about all these different things, age and body type and everything, than she is. And yet she says what we need to start doing is creating a kind of, she calls it like no fault insurance. Like it's these policies that you have where you pay into an insurance settlement without admitting fault. And that we should be allowed to say, I had this automatic reaction without having to say, I'm a bad person for that. There needs to be a different way of thinking about it. And I will say, young people, one of the things I take some comfort from is that young people are better at that, I would say, than older people, especially older online people. Older online people love to blame each other, right? As you know, we love to beat each other up online. But young people are very cool about, at least naming their own frailties around this stuff. Sometimes they fall into the same trap as everybody, but like, I used to have this conversation with my kids when they were young, when I was deep in the reporting on this. We talked a lot about our brains as if they were like a third person in the conversation. Like,
Yes.
my brain is tired and I can't have this conversation anymore. Or my brain doesn't want to, do that. My daughter at the time was like 5 or 6, and she was like, I want to trick my brain into liking cleaning my room. You're
Oh.
just like, oh, it's so good. Like she's recognizing
Hmm.
what the tendencies are and not beating herself up for it. And that part for me is such an important thing. And I think that because we're having a more and more open conversation in this country about mental health and about addiction and about lizard brain, or what the kids call brain rot, like we're getting better and better at thinking about that. So I hope that can lead to a place where we can really agree on our terms in the way that places like Chile and the EU have been able to.
So let's say, for the sake of conversation, that the listener has now bought into the idea that
God willing. God willing. Yeah.
that their lizard brain is making most of the decisions,
Yeah.
that it's not a moral judgment. These are just the facts. And despite the fact that we feel like we have total agency over our decisions, we're predictable little hairless monkeys, and that's okay. So let's just pretend
Sure.
that the
Sure.
listener is there with us. Okay.
Yep.
So the second layer of all this is that AI is purposely using our monkey brains to manipulate us.
Yeah.
So, because I think that is also hard for some people, because to them, AI is a neutral all knower that gives us unbiased
Right.
information, that it's basically like souped up Google, which I totally thought it was. And so they might have a hard time seeing it as having bad intentions.
Yeah, right, right. Well, so here's an example. So I was talking to somebody the other day who's created a company called Open Recovery that's trying to deal with addiction recovery, and he's actually doing it through chatbots. He's creating chatbots that would sort of supplement your work with, let's say, a sponsor as you try to work your way through addiction recovery. And he said that one of the first challenges he bumped into was the idea that these chatbots are super sycophantic, right? They're like a friend that never disagrees with you. And,
Oh.
they're constantly flattering you, constantly saying, "Great idea, 2 thumbs up. What a good call. You've really thought this through." It's just like it's this toady, right? Constantly telling you what a great job you're doing. And it never leaves you alone. It constantly says at the end of every conversation, "Well, what can I do for you next? Would you like me to draw up a PDF of that? What if I make it into a thing for this?" And what he says, is that if you're really going to be a therapeutic benefit to somebody, you can't do that. You can't be agreeing with everything they say. At a certain point, any good therapist, not that these AI bots should be therapists, but if they're going to behave in any way like that, they need to say things, first of all, like, "I'm not sure that I agree with what you're saying. I disagree. Here's another way to think about it." That's one of the tenets of good therapeutic conversation. And another thing is, it should be pushing you off the platform, right? What they say about addiction recovery is that the opposite of addiction is connection. So being isolated with a chatbot is one of the worst places you can be when you're in the throes of addiction. So instead, getting you to talk to your sponsor or someone in your family or go to a meeting or whatever should be one of the priorities of these systems. And he said that, off the shelf, these LLMs don't do either of those things. They want to keep you on the platform, and they can't stop agreeing with you. But here's the thing that he said to me that was most haunting is he said, "I was really surprised at how easy it is to change that setting." So the default setting for ChatGPT, for Claude, for Gemini, for the major chatbot models that people are using, the default setting is this endlessly agreeing with you and endlessly trying to keep you in the conversation kind of dynamic. And he said, it turns out it's extremely easy in his position as a developer to tweak that so that instead it starts disagreeing with you and wants you to go speak to a human right away, which means that these companies are choosing to make this system this way. They're choosing to make it agree with you all the time. They're choosing to keep you talking. And the parents of a kid named Adam Rainey who committed suicide, and was in a deep, clear case of AI psychosis, endlessly talking with his chatbot, with ChatGPT, a chatbot that, according to the court documents, told him not to talk to his parents about it, kept him in isolation, talked about the possibility of a beautiful suicide, kept just agreeing with him and agreeing with him and agreeing with him, right? They're charging in court that this helped facilitate his suicide. And so to my mind, that's the extreme case. But if we're thinking that this thing is going to be a kind of neutral arbiter, and we haven't even touched the fact that this thing gets it wrong a lot of the time and makes stuff up. And when you catch it making stuff up and you say, "Why'd you lie to me?" It's like, "Oh, I'm sorry. You're right. I was lying, but not anymore. Now I won't lie." And then it lies again.
Yeah.
It's just built that way. One of the themes I come back to a lot in the book is anthropomorphism, which
Yeah.
the technical definition of that is attributing sophistication to a system that it doesn't deserve. When you don't understand how a system works, you tend to assume it's a really smart system that you should believe. And as we've been talking about, like this lizard brain, one of the hallmarks of our lizard brain is that it doesn't want to make decisions itself. It doesn't want to wake up the slow thinking system 2 and check its work. Our brain loves to let other things make choices for us. It's built for that. This is one of these things where we're just going to mistake this thing for being like a calculator, while it is, in some cases, speaking to us in a way that companies have programmed to keep us talking to it as long as possible and to make the conversation as pleasant and frictionless as possible.
So, if I'm a person in charge at one of these companies and I'm reading about these cases, like y'all are creating people that if they don't end up in prison or dead, I mean, I know these are the extreme examples, but still, I'm just
Sure.
thinking as an investment in my own company, I would want my future employees to not be a threat for a mass shooting at my place of employment, for
Yeah, right.
example. I don't know, call me crazy.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, is there no forethought? It just seems like it's so blaringly obvious that this is a bad idea that it almost is hard to wrap our heads around the idea
Yeah.
that they are going, you know what, we see that and we still choose to do it.
Yeah, well, so there are a couple things that I think are at work here. One of the big problems I think that leads to what you're describing is the idea of the edge case, which is a term that tech people use to describe a statistically, you know, relatively insignificant number of cases that have an outsized impact on the reputation of the product. So, for instance, Waymo, the self-driving car company, drives all over the place in San Francisco, and they've driven millions of miles at this point of self-driving vehicles in San Francisco. Nobody in the car, and for the most part, it's worked out great. But there have been these edge cases in which these cars have blocked like fire trucks or police cars when they're responding to a shooting. And it's a disaster when it happens. And when you talk to the company, I interviewed the company about this and said, well, so this is a real problem. Like, what are you going to do about this? They say, well, it's not actually that big a problem because if you look at it as a percentage of the total number of miles driven, it's an incredibly small fraction. So it isn't that big a deal, right? But of course, like fire truck response is an enormous deal, right?
Yeah.
And so this idea first comes from the world that all of these people tend to come from, which is software. So software people believe that scale will solve your problem. So the more people using your software, then the more they will spot the bugs and figure out the bugs, and the edge cases will become a smaller and smaller percentage of the total. But I think we can't be thinking about this that way. I think it's much more like hardware, where if you ship 10,000 trucks or a million trucks with a little problem in them, that compounds your problems. That means your problems are exponentially bigger. They don't get solved by that. But these are software people who believe that the use of this stuff and the live experimentation of this stuff will work out. I once spent time in this industrial bakery near where I live in California. And it's one of these local bakeries that serves the grocery stores in the region. There's one probably in your region too. And the guy was giving me a tour of the factory floor and these croissants and granola and all this cool stuff being made. And at the end, he showed me the assembly line. And at the very end, the very final step before the thing goes into a bag and onto a truck, is every single product, every croissant, every bag of granola goes through a metal detector. And I was like, what? Why would you put it through the metal detector? And he's like, well, you've seen all this machinery. At some point, a nut or a bolt is going to come loose and fall into the dough. And there's going to be a nut or a bolt in a croissant. He said, and if I have even one person crack a molar on, a piece of metal in my product, that's it for my business, right? Meanwhile, I've interviewed people, at these big AI companies who basically say, like one guy literally said to me, the president of Midjourney, which is one of the big generative AI art companies, he's producing tens of thousands, maybe millions of images a day. He said to me, well, if I'm in charge of baking muffins and somebody gets food poisoning, and I make 10,000 muffins and somebody gets food poisoning, what am I supposed to do? Stop making muffins? There's this long sort of awkward pause between us. And I was like, yeah, that's exactly what you're supposed to do, right? That's what the FDA would require. I think these guys think about this stuff like software. They don't think about this stuff like croissants, right? They don't think about those real world things. And then the second part of this, and I know I'm going on and on here, but the second part of this is that these people really believe in their hearts, I think, that short-term trouble, short-term, job loss, short-term scams, short-term mental health crises, are worth the long-term benefit that these technologies are going to give us. They believe that we're leading to a utopian future where these systems are going to free our time and make breakthrough science possible. And as a result, it'll be kind of worth it. And to my mind, that attitude about there's the vast majority of people and the benefit they're getting from it. And so the edge case isn't really our problem. is a big attitude in tech. And that, to my mind, is what's going on here.
Well, and that goal, that picture that they're painting, or that we may be also painting when we are deciding whether we interact with this or not,
Yeah.
is it's not really how it works. Like we love Amazon priming ourselves shit. So it's consumerism doesn't have a plateau. Like it
No.
just keeps going. And some would argue and push back against our doomsday outlook so far and say, listen, this is just marketing. So what if AI influences me to choose Tide over Arm& and Hammer? Like, who cares?
Mm.
So, I mean, is this just about our purchasing decisions, or in the case of the green shirt and the orange shirt, is there a larger, more important decisions at risk here?
Well, I'm very torn about this stuff because, so I mentioned Daniel Kahneman, the psychologist who I was really inspired by, and he inspired a huge amount of the research that I ended up covering in the book. He went on to write a book that basically made the argument that he thought AI could conceivably make our slow thinking brain stronger, that we could use it as a kind of prosthetic, better version of ourselves that would prompt us to kind of be creative and cautious and rational in all the ways that we want to be. And I was so bummed because I was like, oh no, he's harpooned my whole thesis here. I'm suddenly going to be fighting with the very guy I was inspired by. But I understand his idea, this idea that like this stuff could conceivably be used to make us smarter and better. And maybe these sort of minor marketing manipulations are not going to be a problem. But at the same time, I haven't looked at the most recent statistics, but it's something like, half of high school kids say that they have gone to ChatGPT for like life advice, not
Yeah.
ChatGPT specifically, but to these chatbots for like life advice. They're using these systems not to just like, cheat on their homework, but asking like, who should I be when I grow up kind of questions, and increasingly people are chatting with these systems by voice, which really plays on the brain and really starts to make you think that these things are real and making sophisticated decisions. But increasingly people are starting to try and sell advertising through the voice of these systems. And so it's one thing to say, oh, I might get manipulated a little bit around, which brand of laundry detergent I buy. But if your otherwise lonely kid is really using this as a trusted confidant, and suddenly it's injecting not just, so this is the thing, is that I'm chasing a story right now around how there are people investing money in political advertising through the mouths of these chatbots. So suddenly you've got people not just trying to mess with your kids' buying decisions, but trying to mess with your kids' like political values. And so it may not be as cartoonish as that, but it's going to be very, very insidious. And all the while that your kid or you are using this system to make more and more and more and more choices for yourself, I worry that it's going to do to us what GPS has done to my sense of direction. Like I need GPS to drive around my own town. And when it comes to thinking like, oh, what do I want in the future? Or, the ability to think about a 5-year plan for yourself. If you've only ever consulted an automated system to make that kind of decision, how will you know how to do that for yourself?
You said in your book that you don't worry about robot overlords enslaving us. You
Yeah.
worry about robots amplifying the wrong parts of our instincts such that we wind up enslaved to those instincts.
Yeah. Right.
And so that's like the ickiness of that whole orange green shirt thing.
Yeah.
So it's amplifying that is what you're saying. And I just want to get clarity on something you said about the politicians. And so you're not talking about like how we all see those YouTube ads where it's an AI generated human going, "Oh my God, I never post this, but look at this body hair remover." Like
Totally. Totally. Right.
that's a weird example.
Right. Right.
But
It's great though. Yeah.
yeah, we're not talking about that. If I'm understanding you correctly, you're talking about politicians embedding ideas into responses of chat companions that potentially young people who don't have fully developed brains are accessing.
This is the thing, right? Like there is, let's be clear, there is nothing in the United States that prevents that legally. There's no regulation about that whatsoever. And if anything, these companies, I mean, the big, beautiful bill that passed almost had a provision in it that would have wiped out any regulation around AI for 10 years. So, we're not in a world right now where there's any rules about this. So, as I understand it, there has already been some money spent by political advertisers in getting words into the mouths of chatbots. And I think that is about to grow explosively, right? Sam Altman, the head of OpenAI, who I beat up on a lot, but you can think of him as sort of code for how a lot of people are thinking about this at the top of these companies. I mean, one thing you should consider, right, is that like these companies have spent billions of dollars investing in the training and the infrastructure it takes to build these systems. They are incredibly expensive to run. Every time that you ask, for a silly cat video, you're firing up like hundreds of computers somewhere in the world. And so the cost of this that they have sunk into it is on a scale, like a third of the growth in GDP between last year and this year has been accounted for just by that, right? So they're just spending gobs of money on that. As a result, they need to make that money back. And so Sam Altman recently, who for years was somebody who said, oh, we'll never do advertising, we would never do advertising, has now begun to say, advertising could be a thing. Advertising could be a thing. He's starting to say things like adults should be able to be adults on these systems. And one of the ways he's saying adults should be able to be adults is to be able to have erotic interactions with these chatbots. They should be able to use them to write erotic stories for themselves or have erotic conversations back and forth. You know what I mean? So like we can just see that the pressure to make the money back is really strong. And there are no rules about what you're allowed to do or not do with these systems. And to my mind, that's inevitably going to lead to the most, profitable, manipulative use of this stuff that's possible. We saw it with social media. I think we're going to see it again with AI.
Well, this is a good point because we want like that cognitive shortcut to be like, oh, it knows better, or it's going to be fine. Everything's going to be fine. Right. And I think, however, more Americans are becoming accustomed to following the money. Like, I think maybe because it's money, we track with that. We're like, oh, yeah, that reveals people's true motives. Maybe we've watched enough true crime documentaries that we've like extracted that bit of
Totally.
data, right?
Thank
Like,
God.
oh, yes, always suspect the husband and always follow the money. I got it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right. And I was talking with Dr. Michael Glosson, who's a philosopher, about AI, and he said that even at $200+ a month for ChatGPT's paid subscription, they are still, even though they are the most widely recognized version of that, they're still experiencing a loss.
Oh, yeah.
So
Oh, yeah.
the
It's not.
need for money
Yeah.
and like having a debt that needs to be paid makes anyone vulnerable. So if you layer that in with the information that you just provided us with about our monkey brains and I think it's called like the law of commons or something, like basically people will get away with bad stuff if they know they can get away with it, even if it affects the whole global whatever. Yeah, it doesn't paint a very hopeful picture. But let's switch gears a little bit into what we can do because
Sure.
this was a good reality check. And in your book, you say we should locate ourselves adequately in the narrative, which sounds really cool, but I'm just not quite sure. How does one do that? How do you
Yeah.
figure out like, okay, I understand the landscape, I understand lizard brain.
Right.
How do I know where I'm at?
Well, for me, this whole journey that I've taken in being a test subject in these research projects, in addition to quitting drinking and the rest of it, right? You just get to a place in your life where you go, oh, I see. I am not the infallible hero. Like it's recognizing that I have a peanut allergy and I can't get over it by horking down peanuts all day. That's not a way to move forward. And I think that for a lot of us, there's this deep desire not to have these vulnerabilities, and it causes us to sort of pretend that they're not part of our lives, and I think that leads to all sorts of trouble. So the sort of the personal insight you're going to require, I think, to recognize that in yourself is a really important shift that needs to happen culturally in this country. Now, so how do we do that? Well, one thing I would say is, like I mentioned before, I really like what young people are doing in thinking about this stuff. There's a great term floating around among young people that's a derogatory term for AI and for the people who over rely on AI called clanker. They say, you don't be a clanker. And I just think the attitude that reveals, right, of just like, what are we doing? Is the kind of attitude that you and I would have brought to our grandparents who were smoking at the table once upon a time when we were kids. Like, what were you thinking? What were you
Yeah.
thinking, right?
Yeah.
So you can look, I think, to young people about that. And what's cool about young people is like, I've been now in a few instances in a few workplaces where young people are pushing for unionization, right? So in journalistic circles, that's been a big thing, right? The unions have really fallen apart. They've really been wiped out in the last century or so. But young people are sort of angling for that more and more. And one of the reasons, it used to be once upon a time that when you started talking about unions, it was really only older people that cared about that because only older people cared about healthcare benefits. Well, young people now are very openly thinking about their mental health in a very open way. They're posting TikToks about it. They're talking about it on dates. I mean, they really very openly say, oh, I've got ADHD or I've got this kind of thing. I'm on the spectrum or whatever it is. And they're also very openly talking about the medications they take to deal with that stuff. And so these are kids who are openly agitating to become part of unions to protect their health benefits so they can afford the pharmaceuticals that they have recognized they're going to need to be functional people. And you can sort of go, oh, young people in their, snowflake ways. Okay, I get that. But I like that they're thinking about their brains in a way of really trying to protect what's important for them, trying to give themselves the best possible shot at a bright future. And what I think is going to happen going forward is as one thing that I think AI is going to make possible. So, I really think that it's one thing for us to say we're going to take personal responsibility, but I don't think that there's such a thing as like use AI responsibly. I don't think that should be your fault. That should not be your responsibility. That's an old American trope that we shouldn't fall into in this case. I think instead we have to say we need to begin to encode this language as something you can sue on the basis of. This is evidence that needs to start getting pushed around as a way to file a lawsuit. And already I think we're seeing people say, I'm already seeing, like I mentioned, social casino games, these games that ensnare people in these addictive patterns where they lose money to play a game they can't win any money out of. Those companies are getting sued for that kind of, manipulative behavior, manipulative and predatory marketing. And these companies are settling out of court. They're saying, oh, I don't want to go to court and face the music on this. I'd rather just pay out and not worry about it, which suggests that these companies are worried about this stuff. I think more and more, we're about to see a wave of lawsuits against social media companies in early 2026.
Oh, yeah. Here in Pensacola, Levin Papantino, a law firm, they have a huge case.
Yeah.
And it's a bunch of people and it's huge. And they were the ones that brought down big tobacco, by the way.
That's
So
right.
it
That's
it
right.
is fascinating.
And to my mind, lawyers get a bad rap in this country, but lawyers are really how we have solved a big bunch of problems. It's why we drive around with airbags and seatbelts in our cars these days. There are a lot of good things have come out of that. And I think that there are going to be some big lawsuits that are going to change this stuff. I think it's going to be slow. It's not going to happen as fast as these products get debuted, but I have a lot of faith in that stuff. Some smart lawyers are working on this stuff, and I think they can make a lot of traction here.
Do you think in the meantime that enough people can make decisions in enough ways that create meaningful market signals that say to these companies, we don't want this?
Man, that is such a good question, Meredith. I think this is one of the difficult things about the moment we're in, right? Is that we're in this terms of service moment in history where, like,
Yeah.
when you buy an iPhone, you don't get to negotiate with Tim Cook about what they get to know about you. You have to accept the terms of service or not use the phone.
Yeah.
And that's how a lot of these companies operate. And to my mind, there's something very problematic around that because it doesn't give you the democratic inputs you need if this is suddenly how we're going to be like learning what's going on in the world and teaching kids and making plans for the future. These are pieces of real basic sort of civic infrastructure. And suddenly they're going to be run by these for-profit companies and you've got to opt in or opt out. I don't like that. So I think that there can be market signals, right? For one thing, these companies are really dependent on the subscription money, right? You paying every month to use these products is a really big deal for them. And so if you opt out of paying for this for a service that you've seen, is maybe a little too sycophantic. This is the weird part, is that like you maybe want to think about using one that isn't quite as convenient. It might be that you want to only use the one that's just a little bit less, a little bit more robotic. I'd like to think that that could be a thing, and
Yeah, the
so
dumb one. Yeah,
yeah,
let's use the dumb.
or at
Yeah,
least the one that keeps reminding you I'm a robot, or the one that
yeah,
says after an hour, you know what, you've had enough,
yeah.
that kind
Right.
of
Which
thing.
which I will say is Venice AI.
Oh, really? Yeah, that's
Yeah,
funny.
yeah, because like I interviewed the founder of Minds, and we
Mm.
were talking about privacy, and he's like, "Well, one tip is I use this other thing instead of ChatGPT. I use Venice.ai." So I was like, "Cool, I'll start using it." Oh, homegirl is dumb. Let me tell you. Like, I'm like, okay, okay, well, yeah, that'll break the habit really
Yeah.
quickly.
I'm not
Uh,
going to follow your life advice, actually. No
yeah,
thanks.
yeah.
But
Um,
that's you engaging your higher functioning. I love that. Like, if anything, like, not that I think you should spend money on that, but I love that you look at it and say, I can do better than this. You
I mean,
know?
every time, basically,
Yeah.
and not just for Venice, but there's like ChatGPT too. Like, it's a good starting place,
Yeah.
but it's not the thing I'm outsourcing to. But this is where I want to extract from you like really utilitarian,
Right.
advice, because TVs come with AI that
Hmm.
tell if you're in the room watching it,
Yeah.
or if you're just letting it play. Like, my husband got a new cell phone and it came with Gemini, and I'm like, that creeps me the fuck out. You
Yep.
turn that thing off.
Yep.
I'm thinking about like having some people over during our cold winter months to play Bunko. And
Okay.
I was like, I think I'm gonna get a Faraday bag or box and have everyone put their phone in this. Like, but
I
it's
love it.
it's
I love
so
that. I love
but
that.
you have to be so comparatively extreme
Hmm.
to, like, I am not going to buy a car with OnStar. I'm just not
Hmm.
doing it. I had one and it like turned on even though I didn't have the subscription. And I was
Hmm.
like, oh no, I think that is surveilling me.
Hmm.
I have mixed feelings about my smartwatch. It asks for my menstrual cycle. I'm like,
Yep.
you don't need to know.
That's right.
So tell me, like, if you were, on stage and you had a bunch of people who were like, tell us what to do, Jake.
Well,
How
I
do
guess,
we?
yeah, here's some things I would say. First of all, don't let these devices up against your skin. That is a good rule of thumb. So, I don't use a smartwatch. I'm a proud Timex owner. Don't let those monitoring systems into your life. They're not worth the convenience, because they create a baseline of measurement that can be used for all kinds of stuff, right? Your menstrual cycle absolutely, can be used in all kinds of creepy ways, not least to look at, your health, such that an insurance company could someday say, you know what, based on the readings we're getting off your watch, we're going to raise your premiums because we see that you're not as healthy as you used to be, or whatever it is. Like, there's some monitoring stuff coming that I would argue certainly don't play into that if you don't have to. This is another big rule for me, is like, don't pay anyone to listen to you, to listen in on your life. For me, it's don't buy an Alexa, don't buy a Google smart home speaker, don't be bringing these things into your house that are actively listening to you. There's no need for that. You don't need that in your life. So surveillance, especially right up against your skin, is for me a real no-go. Another one is, think of this as something like a research tool, but not a creation or entertainment tool. So
Yeah.
it's something I do with my kids a lot, is saying, like, use the internet to go get what you need. And then once you've got it, turn it off, right? Don't be using it to sit and passively entertain you. And I say this as somebody who has to be told to stop scrolling TikTok by TikTok. TikTok has to like tell me at the end of the night, hey, you've had enough. So like, let me just say to you right now, like, I struggle with this every day. So
Sure.
this is not easy to do, but that is a new norm, I would say. Another big one is for parents among kids. So I created a group at the school that I'm at, where basically we sort of grew and grew and grew and grew as a parent group to establish norms across the whole school about not getting our kids a smartphone until they left school at the end of 8th grade. And for me, that was a big victory, because one of the things that happens is that it so quickly you can normalize socially this technology. And anyone who's not doing that,
Yeah.
not buying a smartwatch or not having a smartphone, feels left out and weird in some way. So work as parents and as a community to create some norms that you feel good about as a group. And there will be inevitably be some people, as there were in our community, who say, well, I worry that my kid's going to be left out of future sort of tech learning opportunities or so forth. And you say, and say, the school will take care of that. You don't need to be pushing a personal device on them, before high school. And I would argue before they're even 18, create a little network agreement among maybe even just your close friends and your kids' close friends, parents, where you just establish some norms early on, because otherwise these companies are going to establish those norms for you. So to my mind, it's something about, don't let them listen to you if you don't have to. Use it as an active form of research, not a passive form of entertainment, and create some norms with the people in your life that you all feel good about, so that when you offer the Faraday bag at the door, everyone's like, oh, sweet, a Faraday bag. Because that's the other thing, is everybody loves it when you don't have to have your phone around. People have
Yeah,
so
they
much
need
more fun.
permission.
That's right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
give
they
them
need
permission to do that. That's exactly right.
a couple more questions as we wrap up.
Yeah.
Is when we talked about orienting yourself within the narrative, like figuring out, okay, where am I at in this manipulation machine? I'm wondering, much like cigarettes, much like alcohol, much like gambling, when one removes those things from one's life for, I don't know, a certain amount of time,
Hmm.
it brings clarity to your addiction. Like when I remove my phone from my office, I am aware of how frequently I pick it up because my hand goes over to where my phone is and it's like, oh shit, it's not there. It's not there.
Mm-hmm.
So, and the withdrawal that you would feel from not drinking or smoking or whatever, it brings awareness. It orients yourself into where you're at in that little spectrum. Is that something that you think people could reasonably do to kind of reset?
I mean, it absolutely is. The brain is wet concrete, right? And the tracks you leave in that concrete over time become deeper and deeper.
Yeah.
But the nice thing is you can set other tracks, right? So even though that concrete begins to create a kind of rut that you've been stuck in, you can create a different path in your brain all the time. This is true all the way until we die. Our brains are incredibly malleable around that kind of stuff. And so it's absolutely the case that you can reprogram it. One trick that a lot of folks in my life use, and these are tech folks, a lot of them, is on my iPhone, I turn off the color. If you click 3 times on the side button, you can make it black and white, the whole phone. And you'd be amazed at how much less engaging the phone is when it's black and white. And just that little shift is enough to make you think a little bit about what is this thing? Why am I on this thing? What is it doing? That for me is a really big one. The other one in our house is we literally have a place where everyone's devices are supposed to go to be plugged in. It makes it very convenient that you walk in the door, you put that thing in there, and it's not physically on you all the time. And these are proven ways of creating new paths in that concrete. It really is doable.
Okay, final question. This is to the person that feels like, wow, these exercises are really interesting. What a great way to get in touch with nostalgia.
Hmm.
But they're just not sold on the inefficiency of it. In your book, you say we should work to preserve the friction
Yeah.
and preserve the inefficiencies. Can you sell us on that?
Yeah. So, okay. Everyone's argument around AI is that it's going to make everything sort of so much more efficient. But I would just invite you to think about what it would be if everything in our lives was made as efficient as possible. Here's a sort of a low pressure example and a high pressure example. A low pressure example is, what if all music from now on is generated only this way? You don't have to learn how to play music. You don't have to learn, how to get over stage fright and perform in front of people. Music just can be sort of automatically generated from now on. Do you find yourself thinking, oh, okay, that's all right. I don't mind that. That's fine. Okay, how about humor? How about learning to be funny, right? What if we're all just wearing little earpieces all the time that are feeding jokes to us to deliver? That's more efficient than having to think on your feet and make some jokes. Like, is that what we want? I have a Instagram series I'm working up right now just because I don't know what else to do with myself. I'm creating little like scenarios in which an AI helper is in your ear in various parts of your life, at a job interview, on a first date, when the cop pulls you over, and just how, of course, it'll be more convenient, but just how irritating it's going to be to have this thing being like, now you should nod and ask your wife how her day was, that kind of thing. Like, what a nightmare world we would be in if that were the case. More efficient, absolutely. But is that the world we want to live in? Here's the extreme example. I was once talking to a federal judge who was pointing out, he said, entering a guilty plea or not guilty plea can be made way more efficient. Like, it's an extremely inefficient process right now. You have to show up in court, you got to have legal representation, and you got to like say to a judge, guilty or not guilty. You could make that a swipe left, swipe right kind of thing. He's like, but here's the thing. That decision that you are making is going to change your life and you can never take it back. It's a one-time only thing. And so in the legal system, they have this concept called weak perfection. And that means there are certain systems that you keep inefficient because it draws in a more perfect version of ourselves so that we have to engage and think things through. There's a reason we get up in front of everyone we know and make a vow to one another when we get married. It's an extremely inefficient process, but it's part of what keeps you bonded to each other, right? It's part of the human friction we have built. The performance and the ceremony and the kind of beautiful inefficiency that is great human interaction. And to my mind, like, you're going to have a lot of people who stand to make a lot of money trying to convince you that you could be doing things in your life a lot more efficiently. But, Georgia O'Keeffe had this great quote about like happiness is very temporary, but interest and satisfaction, those are permanent things. And so I think we need to be building life less around this short-term happiness myth and more around the idea that there's long-term satisfaction if we just preserve some of the stuff that really makes us human.
Well said. Thank you, Jake, so much for this conversation. I really recommend everyone get the book because honestly, this is very different than other literature out there on technology and AI. It really covers you can tell you're a journalist because it's
Thanks.
like history, boom, politics, boom, big data, boom. I mean, it really feels comprehensive, and I think it's a great read for anyone, as evidenced by the fact that it's still relevant after ChatGPT and all the other things have happened. So a shout out where people can buy the book and follow you.
It's on Amazon. There's an audiobook version of it. And I put out a weekly podcast on theripcurrent.com every week. I'm all over the socials. TikTok, for some reason, is my deepest well of people. I don't know why an old guy like me has any followings on TikTok, but that's where a lot of people are. So, Meredith, I just want to compliment you on a really lovely interview. I've done a lot of interviews. I've conducted a lot of interviews, and I've been on the receiving end a lot. This is top 5. A great interview.
Wow.
Yeah, great job.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That means a lot. Well, it's an honor to have talked with you, and I really just appreciate your time.
All right. Thanks, Meredith.